So the prior segment argued that the threat to deploy physical force and the actual use of force are both necessary to create a stable political order. At the same time, once you endow individuals or political organizations with this capacity, you also grant them the capacity to exploit that power for their own gain, potentially to increase their coercive power. This dependence and potential for exploitation creates something called the coercion dilemma in politics. You can think about the risks associated with the coercion dilemma in terms of something called predation. Predation is the forcible redistribution of a resource or thing of value. This is the political equivalent of armed robbery by armed robbery or murder by some political organization. We can think about predation in terms of conquering armies. They get to seize what they conquer. For example, Hitler's armies took new territory in Eastern Europe in the first phases of World War II. They used the resources from these conquered territories to feed their army, resupply it, and feed Germans working in factories. So there's a big challenge in the coercion dilemma here. I'm saying that political stability rests on the capacity to enforce directives with violence. But the problem is this power can also be used for predation, theft, exploitation, or something even worse, mass murder in the case of Nazi Germany. So we need this military power to create social orders and protect people from others. But this military power can simultaneously be abused with horrible consequences. So this coercion dilemma then sets up an important question that tells us a lot about the political health of any society. How do you endow a government with enforcement capacity, but constrain it simultaneously so that this power cannot be abused? Successful societies over the long run have solved this coercion dilemma, often through democracy. Now, this same dilemma operates in international politics. In the textbook, we described the security dilemma as the international equivalent of this more general coercion dilemma. History has long seen predators that use military force to plunder and redistribute resources away from the weak. Hitler's wars of expansion after 1939 illustrate this. You can think about the rapid expansion of ISIS throughout Iraq and Syria in the summer of 2014 in similar terms. What would happen if no countervailing force stepped up to stop these armies? I don't think it's a stretch to say that they would have continued to expand. Their predation would have become self-sustaining. They use force to take new territory. They then use the newly captured resources to feed their armies and rearm them again, recruiting more soldiers along the way if necessary, and then doing the same all over again. Sometimes these attempts to forcibly expand need to be countered with military force. This is why the Allied powers intervened in World War II. So if predation and violent conquest is not stopped, what's the alternative? The alternative for the conquered is a political life of concession and exploitation in which groups are unwilling to protect themselves. Okay, so let's use the examples of ISIS, Iraq in 2003, and Germany here to think about the implications of this coercion dilemma for U.S. foreign policy. They suggest that the United States has faced a long-term dilemma when confronting German expansion in 1939, the territorial expansion of ISIS in 2014, or Iraq in 2003. These situations created a demand for U.S. military power to roll back the German conquest of Europe or to topple Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq and to transform the Middle East. Now, admittedly, there has been some significant disagreement over the immediacy of this need in 2013 and in 2014. Much of the world opposed the American war against Iraq in 2003. Given this demand, though, we see the U.S. intervenes with force, and in each of these cases, the U.S. then plays a significant role in defeating a predatory enemy. Okay? Military victory, though, brings a new challenge. How do you legitimate any new demonstration of U.S. military power after it has been deployed? Think about it this way. Even if people agreed with the use of war to topple Saddam Hussein, is the continuation of an American military presence in Iraq after 2004 still legitimate? If so, why? Many argue that the legitimate use of force to generate a social order rests on acknowledging a set of rules or limitations that govern the conditions under which force is used, and then abiding by those limitations. But remember the dilemma. If you have the military power to rewrite the rules as you go, how can you then reassure everyone that you won't rewrite the rules governing the use of force anytime so it suits your immediate interests? The United States solved this dilemma of political authority after 1920 by simply withdrawing militarily from Europe and then retreating to isolationism in the 1930s. This withdrawal then created a new set of problems, a political vacuum that Hitler filled by engineering a massive new military force that threatened huge chunks of the world with death.
Okay, so the U.S. faced this same coercion dilemma challenge in 1945. It helped defeat Germany and then found itself in possession of the capacity to govern much of Western Europe. Now, how did the U.S. solve this dilemma, making the continued use of American military power legitimate in Europe during the 1950s and the 1960s? On the one hand, the existence of the Soviet threat itself helped to solve this dilemma during the Cold War. For America's enemies, the alternative to American hegemony, succumbing to communism and Soviet control, was a lot worse than an alliance with the United States. America's role as the principal military force containing the Soviet Union thus helped to legitimize the use of American military power during the Cold War. Now note that this dilemma risks disappearing in the absence of a Soviet threat, a possibility that was reinforced by the 2003 Iraq War. Now, a second argument made by a political scientist named John Eikenberry is that the U.S. successfully bound its own power after World War II, making it legitimate by subjecting it to the constraints of democracy in the United States and a series of international organizations like NATO or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So in the case of democracy within the United States, the president cannot use force until getting support from Congress and the public. This creates important constraints on the use of military force that then help to reassure other countries that it won't be used arbitrarily. Participating in a multilateral alliance like NATO can do the same thing. The expectation is that the U.S. will consult its allies in NATO, giving them some capacity to influence the decisions to use military force. But the war against Iraq in 2003 questioned these claims and reopened the larger dilemma focused on here in this module. A number of American allies opposed the decision to go into Iraq, and yet the United States did it anyway. Quite simply, is the U.S. military power sufficiently constrained, or was the United States embarking on a broader political program, a subtle one, of expansion of U.S. power in the Middle East? Eikenberry wrote a series of articles criticizing the Bush administration in the aftermath of the Iraq War for this very reason. He worried that its failure to observe a series of self-imposed limits on the use of American military power limits that had been at the core of the post-1945 settlement could threaten to provoke a broader backlash from other countries and unwind the larger international political order that had the United States at the center. We can also think about this larger set of global challenges in terms of the status of the United States as the indispensable nation. Political challenges in Central Europe in the 1940s and the contemporary Middle East created demand for outside intervention to stabilize local political orders and prevent the spillover of wars to neighboring countries. The U.S. responded to these strategic challenges.
However, absent limits on this intervention, other countries may resist the deployment of the U.S. military worrying that it will be used to expand U.S. influence and transform domestic political systems throughout the world. Now, we can make an argument that President Trump has offered a solution to this coercion dilemma that the U.S. posed to the world after the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And this solution comes from his withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria and Afghanistan, from his repeated pledges to end U.S. participation in wars, and from the public support that these pledges have secured. These actions help to reassure the rest of the world that there are limits to the U.S. to the use of U.S. military power. More broadly, we want you to remember from this segment that the use of U.S. military power around the world can create a coercion dilemma. While it might be necessary to halt predation and aggressive actions by bad actors in the international system, the use of that military force, while initially for defensive purposes, can generate concerns that it will be used in the future for more sinister purposes. Accordingly, solutions to the coercion dilemma require some credible limitations on the use of military force.